Guys, so welcome to chapter 27 in your textbook, ushistory.org. Be sure to be reading along with this video, or at least have read ahead of time. And if you want, these are the guided notes that I've already made. So if you want to use these, you want to get a copy, just let me know, and I can print them off if you want to kind of use it as a guide as you kind of go through the reading or as you go through the video. But today we're looking at slavery. Of course, if you want to remember, another name for it is a peculiar institution, right? That's kind of a euphemism to kind of downplay maybe the severity of the institution of slavery. Okay, and as we kind of go up and lead up into the Civil War, we want to make sure to understand the role that slavery is playing in causing the war. There's a big debate, although it's getting more settled now, over whether slavery was a cause to the Civil War, or if it was rights, or if it was whatever. But the truth is, slavery undoubtedly played a major role in pulling the states apart. And so the question we want to answer here, the main question for this chapter, is how can we say that slavery was completely a sectional issue? Not just a little bit, not just dabbling in sectionalism, but completely a sectional issue, right? How to divide the states into two separate regions. Remember, when we talk about sectionalism, we're talking about America as regions. So this is the North versus the South, right? Or the Union versus Confederacy. How do we get those splits? All right, how did that happen? Let's look at this, guys. The defining characteristics of American slavery. Remember that slavery is on the way out. Okay, in the 19th century, however, we start to see that the slave economy is going to be dependent on the cotton industry. It's going to be dependent on plantation life. We're going to see those things start to spring up stronger than ever. Many of the pictures that you may envision of slavery and plantations, those don't happen until the 19th century. The big sprawling manor houses and the fields with hundreds of slaves working, that wasn't necessarily a reality in Virginia in the 17th and 18th centuries. That's becoming more and more of a reality as slavery is kind of extending back across to kind of the Old Southwest, this new area of settlement called the Old Southwest, new for this time: Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and then on to Louisiana. It's interesting because slavery has banned actually at this point, turn of the 19th century. The slave trade is gone in 1808, and Great Britain and Mexico are on the way to banning it completely. The U.S. kind of holds on and holds on and holds on because so much of their economy is tied to it. Now, the actual kind of split, the actual framework is going to be this line known as the Mason-Dixon line. You can see it right here. This kind of like sideways L shape. The Mason-Dixon line, this wasn't kind of a hard line drawn between northern and southern states when the Civil War started. It was kind of already in place. It was made by Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, divided Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and West Virginia. This line was actually surveyed in 1763 to 1767. So if you are thinking back to your history, that's right at the time the French and Indian War was over. But this will be the line that we'll start to see the North and South separating upon. North of this line in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, we won't see slavery. Maryland, D.C., Virginia, of course, and West Virginia, we will see slavery. Isn't it interesting that the capital of the United States, right, Washington, D.C., will be south of the Mason-Dixon line, right? So don't think that, everybody south of it's seceding, right? The capital of the United States is south of that line, okay? But we can use that as a convenient borderline to divide the two sections. Now, King Cotton, all right? That's the name we're going to use for kind of this resurgence of an agricultural economy, all right? Cotton is very, very expensive in the 1700s, all right? It's costly. It's a laborious process. Separating seeds from even long staple cotton took quite a while. The cotton gin is going to speed that process up. Not to mention it's going to allow short staple cotton to be processed, all right? I'm going to show you a video here in a minute of that process. Of course, Eli Whitney is the inventor of the cotton gin. He's actually from Massachusetts. So that's kind of interesting. And he actually never made any money whatsoever on his inventions. He never patented it. So this amazing kind of resurrection of the Southern agricultural slave system, he didn't make a dime on, although he did, of course, develop the machine. And this is the machine here. I'm going to pull up, this is a YouTube video. I'll pull it back to the start. I'll let you see here kind of how this works. They're going to show an old cotton gin right here. It's a long staple. So I'm going to play the audio and actually I'm going to get rid of this. Hold on. Then I'll shut up for a minute. All right, so I think you get the idea, right? You see the speed at which the seeds are spit out in this little bucket, right? There's these little, like, I guess they're needles or tongs kind of pulling at the cotton as it goes by, and all the fluffed up, clean cotton devoid of seeds goes in this little, this area right here, all the seeds go over there. And notice the speed at which it can be produced, right? Compared to that old wooden thing. It was very, very slow, even extracting seeds from long staple cotton. All right, so, Eli Whitney, slavery, okay? Cotton production goes up 10 times the factor, from 138,000 pounds when it's invented to 2 years later, 1.6 million pounds. And let me just fact check that date for, there's Eli Whitney right there. So that's incredible, 10 times larger, right? 10 times. It's actually, it's mind-boggling how production is actually able to is able to provide the whole world's demand of cotton. All right, this is 1792, right? So this is actually before even the 19th century starts. This is happening, okay? So keep that in mind too as we think about dates. But slavery is, okay? Americans thought it would fizzle out, right? Slaves could now be used to cultivate cotton, millions of pounds. The Southern economy is not going to be reliant on cotton, right? And culture and pride with all the money. So cotton is king, all right? You can see here this little graphic. Manchester, that's a mill town in England, right? Stepping on the slave's back, of course, and then the southern cotton bales that are going to be brought over actually to Britain. Even though they've eradicated slavery, they're definitely profiting from it. Okay. Now, slave codes. Let's talk about those real quick. Slave codes are a way of keeping slaves in check. Life in a plantation is pretty bad. All right. Obviously, I think there's kind of this idea of like, well, slaves didn't have it as bad as some people did. That's certainly true, I guess, for a very, very small minority. But most slaves, worked from sun up to sundown, 6 days a week. They had poor food quality. They lived in small shacks with dirt floors, little or no furniture, right? And most of the slaves, remember, actually are not on plantations. They're actually at small farmers, kind of homesteads. So if the small farmer is struggling, they don't get fed, right? So, it's kind of a trickle-down effect. And if there's no food, or if there's a blight, or if there's a famine, or whatever, the slave might not be fed. So it's not a situation you really want to be in. It's not like, it's not like the nice prisons we have today where I guess like you can do a workout and you get fed 3 meals a day and you get clothes provided for you. Not that I'm saying you should go to prison, but it's worse in prison. Okay, it's worse in prison. Now those who are in charge of slaves, these are called overseers and drivers. All right, overseer is almost always white. A driver is actually another slave. The overseer was a person who wanted to get the most out of slaves as they could. right? Generally, it's men. Well, it's always men. Men are in charge of all of the economy in the South at this point in time. Drivers, though, slaves themselves, okay? And they're hated, enormously hated. Drivers probably a little bit more because they're actually benefiting from the institution of slavery. They get a little bit nicer treatment than their slave counterparts. And it's kind of interesting, right? We see black slaves perpetuating the system of slavery. We'll see this again in ghettos, Jewish ghettos in World War II, where Jews will actually serve as kind of a police force for other Jews to make sure they kind of stayed in line in the ghetto. Anyway, these relationships cause enormous amounts of violence. They were not a good situation to be in, although you might see your station improve if you were a driver. Domestic slaves, much better conditions than plantations. They had better quarters. They travel with the owner's family. They were actually probably quite close to the owner's family in many cases. They got any of the food that the family did not eat. Okay, and they actually didn't really associate themselves with plantation slaves. They kind of had this class hierarchy inside of the institution, which I think is really interesting. We kind of all gravitate towards a certain class, regardless of if you're considered property or not. Domestic slaves definitely had a sense they were superior to plantation slaves. Slave codes, though, applied to both types, domestic and slaves. There are rules that outline the rights of slaves in general. It varied from state to state, but the five main ones that we can talk about, actually there's probably like seven. I'll run through these real quick. They couldn't do business with the slave without the consent of the owner, right? So, other slaves can't go and buy materials from other slaves without the owner giving consent. They could be one of surprises and raffles. Gambling, they couldn't carry a gun, cannot be witnesses in cases involving whites. Education is prohibited, and marriages are not considered legally binding, right? And this is why, the nuclear family kind of doesn't make as much sense as the extended family in slave society, because the nuclear family can be split up, right? And it wasn't considered legal, right? Kids could be sold, husbands and wives could be sold, and that was fine. But more than likely, you'd probably be left with a cousin or an uncle or an aunt that would be with you kind of through your time in a plantation. Lastly, you could not meet without white consent. So that includes churches, although there are certain ways around that, as we'll see, especially as the African Methodist Episcopal Church gets going. But there's no, there's no sense of like, hey, let's go have a town meeting if we're slaves. Let's go hang out and play blackjack or poker and have a great night like that. Unless your slave owner gives consent, does not happen. Rape, of course, was a common occurrence on plantations, but it wasn't a punishable offense. All right, slaves are considered property, right? And if another white person raped another slave, it would just be considered kind of like a trespass on property instead of an actual, crime, major crime that we would consider today. Now, on the actual plantation, there's a certain code of behavior, and we kind of see this kind of leaking out today. The Southern gentleman, right, is kind of like still the same idea that for some reason has perpetrated throughout the years, right? The South is kind of known for their manners, their etiquette. That's something that has continued, right? It's not completely gone. Well, how did it happen, right? How did this start? Well, tobacco began it. It created a planter class. It created these very, very wealthy landed estate owners, usually on coasts, that were considered kind of country gentlemen, right? They looked for England for manners, for etiquette, their dress, they buy all their luxury goods from over there. All right. Now, as tobacco declines, it's not like all of a sudden the aristocratic planter is gone. It's just transitioned to the cotton planter, right? So it's the same system, different commodity. Okay. And of course, the center of this is not going to be Virginia, as it's been for decades. It's going to be new states, or at least states that would have been on the western frontier, in the late 18th century. So we're looking to South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. Right? This is considered all the old Southwest. And this is where we start to see massive plantations split up, right? And it kind of goes with this code of ethics uh, that are going to define roles, right? What are some of them? And pay attention to these and think like, oh, is this the same today? Does this kind of stereotype hold today for someone who's a Southern man, right? They kind of do, right? So men, supposed to be courteous, truthful, and honorable, right? Sins of the flesh are forgiven, right? So, a sin of the flesh could be considered anything from, I guess, adultery, or getting in brawls at taverns to defend your honor. Those are forgiven, right? Those are forgiven. You're supposed to be educated, though. No literature, no history. We kind of lump those together and call those the humanities. You're supposed to respect your family, right? And treat the woman, at least you're married to, honorably, right? The Southern woman, which we'll get to in a minute, was this kind of badge of honor. So you needed to treat her with that honor, treat her respectfully throughout the time you're married. We don't see divorce. That would be against a code of ethics that defines the role for Southern men. Strength and courage is glorified, and they need to defend their name, right? To sometimes violence or dueling or whatever, right? Even to death. Women, on the other hand, okay, genteel, gracious, entertaining guests, defend their husbands and children. Not supposed to be outspoken or brash or call into question a man's stance on a certain issue. Certainly not supposed to be political. In general, they're supposed to reflect this pure kind of feminineness, right? This grace, this kind of caring purity, right? This elevated, almost angelic, almost divine, on a pedestal, right? This other woman was seen as kind of the main symbol for this. And of course, notice how this would contrast, right, between the idea of rape against a white woman, right? It's different when, I guess, you envision a woman as this elevated, pure, almost divine quality being, kind of subject to the sexual appetites of a black man, right? And so this entrenched idea, which kind of like is only slowly, was very, very slow to go away through the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, is still kind of slow today, although we start to see obviously some change, right? Interracial marriage isn't considered like eyebrow raising, but that's been slow, right? Last 50 years is when that's transitioned, okay? Occupations, Southern gentlemen, lawyers, politicians, planters, military men, right? Not being a businessman. If you were a businessman, you were kind of seen as a swindler, right? Which, I guess in some ways you kind of have to be in 19th century society. So, today, obviously, Southern gentlemen generally all go into business, right? Although, of course, some as lawyers, planters. I guess not really planters anymore. Military man, right? Not necessarily associated with the Southern gentleman either. But the reason why military was a respected occupation was because there are really no great colleges in the South. They're not going to send their kids up to Harvard and Yale. They're going to send them to military institutes like West Point, VMI, or the Citadel, right, to get their education. Which is why we start to see that a lot of Southern men, right, are actually quite brilliant in the battlefield because they've all been educated in military academies. Anyway, here's a good picture, right, showing the elevated status of women, right, especially in relation to kind of the debauchery of slaves around them. Okay. Real quick, I want to take a step back and take a look at a couple of maps. Here is the cotton production areas in 1860, right? So 70 odd years after the cotton gin is invented. Notice where it's strongest, right? Virginia. There's really no cotton there at all, right? I mean, notice how this major production area, this is all short staple cotton, all the way through Texas, right? And this is where we start to see slavery explode. And here, another great chart, right? And this we consider this a kind of a cotton belt, right? Percent of slaves in 1860. Right? Notice how it's following where cotton is grown, right? Appalachia, of course, cannot grow very good cotton, if at all, right? So nothing up here, right? We don't have North Carolina's figures here, but you would see the same blue, 0 to 10. Um, as we get kind of closer down to the cotton belt, right, this we're going to start to pick up on 50% to 75%. This is going to also play into this fear of a slave revolt, right? When you have 75% of your county that is a slave revolt's a real problem, right? Because you're outnumbered at least 3 to 1. So anyway, interesting demographic, interesting map showing, look at this in the Mississippi, right? Showing how America, right, Black America is being formed kind of around this cotton belt area. This kind of perpetrates today, right? These counties today, down here, primarily African American, sure as you know. Okay, although we've seen a mass migration to not as pronounced as it used to be. All right, next thing we want to talk about here is free African Americans. So, contrary to maybe what you thought, there were actually 1.5 million free blacks in southern states in 1860. Okay, 1.5 million. That's actually a pretty startling number. I remember when I learned that, I was like, what? 1.5 million? It's a lot. It is. Now, how do they become free? Okay, well, the first, of course, is you can buy it. We're going to talk about Denmark Vesey in a minute, the guy who won a lottery and bought his own freedom. Second, you could be freed upon the death of your slave owner. That's known as manumission. You could escape to the north, or to Canada, although, of course, that you wouldn't be considered a free black in the southern states, right? If you came back, you'd probably be chased. And then four, if you were an interracial child, you're usually freed, because guess what? The master or maybe an overseer, or at least somebody at a high enough rank in the plantation is probably your father. So anyway, those are 4 ways you can become free. The first two, manumission and buying slavery, is generally the 2 kind of largest ways. All right. 3 ways that the rights of free blacks were restricted. So free blacks, it's not like all of a sudden when you're free and you're black, you got all these rights that whites had. That's not true. Free whites and free blacks do not have the same rights. Now, many times free blacks could be more wealthy than free whites, right? And this gets into this comparison with the white trash demographic we've talked about this year. Many free blacks actually are quite skilled and quite more money than poor whites, right? But their rights were restricted. They couldn't get an education in many states, even if they were free. The courts couldn't get weapons, and they could not testify in court. So what was interesting about that is if you were arrested, all right, under the suspicion that you were a slave, and you went to court, you couldn't testify for your own defense at all. So it wouldn't count. You had to have a white person come in and testify and say, oh yeah, Sam's free, like he bought his freedom 10 years ago, right? So that's a problem, of course, with actually capturing free blacks and bringing them down into the southern states. Free blacks go on to form a very influential church organization. It was the African Methodist Episcopal Church. You might know that today is the AME Zion Church. You might have seen billboards for that. And, the church was one of those kind of few places where slaves could congregate. All right. It was an outlet for education and preaching. It helped blacks meet together. It created the initial actually kind of thrust of the black abolitionist movement, right? So this is happening inside of this new church organization that had previously never existed at all. Other occupations of free blacks, of course, artisans, businessmen, writers, planters, musicians, tailors, hairdressers. You had the best chance of earning money if you learned a skill of some sort. So it wouldn't be actually that odd to see, maybe a black musician, right, who may have been a domestic slave playing the piano or some other sort of skill, buy his freedom after working in or even being loaned out to other plantations close by. Now, as we've already mentioned before, many of these free blacks are the ones that create slave rebellions, okay? Now, there's hundreds of slave rebellions in the South. Most are pretty small and are put down very easily. They might not be any more than maybe a dozen, or if that, be 5 to 10 people on a small plantation. It's usually put down very quickly without anyone dying. But there were two big rebellions during this time period in the early 19th century to talk about. The first was by a guy named Denmark Vesey. Great name. Not sure why it was named Denmark. Not sure why his first name is Denmark. You can find that. I'll give you a test point. What's interesting about this guy is he won a lottery, like a money lottery. This is freedom. He worked in South Carolina as a carpenter, right? He was educated. He was fluent in several languages, actually. And as a free black, he has access to kind of organizing a rebellion. That's exactly what he does. In 1822, he kind of plans on overtaking, kind of creating this wave of slave uprisings throughout South Carolina. Now, like the other ones, Gabriel's rebellion before it is found out early and it's put down. 47 other African Americans were put to death because of their involvement. Next, we have Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Nat Turner's rebellion is what stands as the most successful slave rebellion in U.S. history. Nat Turner was a Christian mystic who said to have spoken with God. God gave him this actual mission to go out and kill whites. And that's exactly what he does. He organizes slaves who go from plantation to plantation and murder 75 white men, women, and children. This is full-fledged slaughter. You can see this right here. This is kind of a primary source showing the death of, death of this genteel Southern woman, right? The Southern gentleman. Now, I need to go back and do some research. I don't think it was these types of people that Nat Turner was killing. It would have been smaller farmers. Once again, in Virginia, we don't necessarily see as massive plantations as we would have down in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama. Okay. Anyway, they run out of ammunition, and he and 18 others are actually hanged and put to death. But this is really the only rebellion we have where whites actually die. Whites actually die from this rebellion. And as a result, right, the white response to both rebellions is incredibly harsh retributions, right? We see 65 people that are hanged as a result of them, and then, of course, a really intense strengthening of the slave codes, right? So, the South reacts kind of just as violently, if not more violently, than the actual rebellions. All right, lastly, guys, we're going to talk about the Southern argument for slavery. What is a moral ground, right, that Southerners, especially as enlightened, educated, genteel, courageous human beings, are giving for the continuance of slavery? All right, and there's 5 main arguments for this. The first is economic. All right, ending slavery would kill the Southern economy, right? It was so dependent on the slave system. If we don't have cotton, we don't have an economy, which makes the South kind of a second-class region to the North, right? So this was already in place, this argument of, well, we need slavery around that we can at least create some sort of economic viability compared with the North, okay? They also thought there would be huge unemployment and chaos, leading to bloodshed and uprisings that was eradicated, or at least the idea that it could be eradicated, right? So there's also a fear aspect. The third argument was that it existed all through history and was natural to mankind. The fourth, a biblical precedent. Okay, this gets to your question down here. How do defenders of slavery use the Bible? Well, there are a lot of reasons why. Abraham had owned slaves. Jesus never spoke out against it. Paul turned the slave away, go back to his master. Even the 10 Commandments mention slavery. So, if you pick and choose from the Bible, you can come up with, I guess, some passages that at least don't overtly say that it's terrible. But if you actually read the Bible and are kind of familiar with the spirit, slavery doesn't really exist inside of Christian spirituality, which is why, right, Quakers, the Christian sect, are going to be kind of the first to, fight against slavery, right? And abolitionists are mostly Christian, right? So it's interesting. I kind of love seeing how you can use religion to kind of buffer two sides of an argument if you selectively choose what you want to believe. Lastly, the institution was seen as being defined by the right? So without slavery, Africa would still be, quote, a dark continent. We'll start to see the same sort of mantra perpetuated again when Africa is colonized in the late 19th century, right? Take the Christian message of the heathen in Africa. Well, in the early 19th century, right, slavery was seen as divine because it gave them the light of God and Jesus. Although they were ripped out of their homes and put in the Middle Passage and carted across the Atlantic Ocean, at least they heard the message of Jesus, right? Anyway, it doesn't seem to hold much rational light, but these are ways that people rationalize slavery, and that's the main reason why it kind of existed side by side with this kind of moral high ground that the South was known for. Okay. All right, that's it for chapter 27. I'm going to leave you guys with a quick video looking at Nat Turner's legacy. Nat Turner's a fascinating character. You actually see him mentioned quite a bit in modern rap lyrics. Maybe that's something we can do in class, just take a look at where it's mentioned. Of course, The Birth of a Nation, you can see it over here, right? Nat Turner, American Revolutionary. This movie that was put out last year has Nat Turner in it. I've actually not seen the movie yet. Maybe I'll see it at some point. But this is definitely a relevant man, and watch this video. His legacy is not dead. It's still very much alive, and we're very kind of re-examining his importance as kind of like this religious outsider, a mystic that may have been viewed as a fanatic, right? But anyway, maybe he did hear God. Who knows, right? Who knows? All right. Enjoy.
I was ordained for some great purpose in the hands of the Almighty.
Nat Turner was an enslaved African-American preacher who was born in 1800 and led a large-scale rebellion in 1831.
Nat Turner's ultimate goal was to end the system of slavery. So he chose violence as his only option. And that option, painful and bloody as it was, shook up the system.
Nat Turner was a mind-blowing experience to white culture and changed the game in a fundamental way.
They vowed before they started their revolt that they would kill every white person they saw. Men, women, and children.
They were done being dehumanized, they were done being treated as property, and they just rebelled.
The rebels followed kind of a zigzag path. They stopped at most of the houses along the way, killing the slaveholders and their families who they found there.
The judgment of this court is that you are to be taken hence to jail, thence to the place of execution, and be hung by the neck until you are dead.
Lynching in America were spectator sports. It was spectator events. People came from miles around, and bodies were dismembered. When people went to these kinds of affairs, they wanted to take a souvenir away that proved to everybody that they were there, and that person, that monster, is now no longer alive. How do I know that? Because I've got a piece of his body right here.
All right, so there you go. Little small tidbit on Nat Turner. Of course, the lynching picture you're seeing was not obviously in 1830. It was more from the 1940s and 50s, actually, another wave of lynching that came around later in the 20th century. But pretty fascinating stuff. All right, that's it for chapter 27. Feel free to come and see me in the classroom if you have any questions. Go work on your questions too that you'll see on the campus, and enjoy. Thanks so much.